Mid-tier transit is essentially an umbrella term for a lot of different transport technologies between a conventional bus and heavy rail. And that means it has a medium capacity. It usually also has a speed that's somewhere between buses and heavy rail. It can thus move more passengers more quickly and is for that reason suited to basically fill that intermediate space between a very high capacity fast mode and a low capacity slow mode. If we only have a system that is based on conventional buses and on heavy rail, like we do in Perth, for example, we miss out on a lot of the public transport market. Heavy rail is good for long distance commuting. Buses are good as a social safety net for people who don't drive. Some buses are getting better in Perth and some rail is being used for short distances, so it's not entirely the gap in between is not entirely unfilled, but medium capacity transit offers us a possibility to actually capture more trips on public transport and also to make public transport oriented lifestyles more possible beyond the daily job commute and beyond the social safety net travel. So it becomes possible with mid-tier transit to actually create a ubiquitous public transport system, a public transport system that people can rely on for an increasing number of journey purposes. So you can essentially start building your life around public transport use. SNAMATS stands for Spatial Network Analysis for Multimodal Urban Transport Systems, and it is a planning support tool. It is part of a family of accessibility tools that are trying to look at transport and land use within the same framework, and that are actually also trying to not just make linear predictions of what sort of transport use we might expect in the future, but also look at the opportunities that come from urban developments and that come from actually changing our transport systems. So we are keen to actually tease out what we call the latent demand for public transport, and this tool enables us to do that. It enables us to show how public transport can grow and become more important in the mobility mix of a city. So SNAMATS has been applied in 30 cities around the world, many in Europe, the 5 largest Australian cities and Auckland, 4 North American cities, now 5 North American cities and 3 Asian cities. We've learned a lot, but what we've learned about Australia, and particularly about our case study cities in Australia in the context of this project, is that mid-tier transit already has a very different role in different cities. In Melbourne, for example, we actually have a good first-generation tram network, a very large tram network that is mid-tier transit, but it only covers the inner and middle suburbs of Melbourne. The outer suburbs of Melbourne, which are growing very fast, and some of those communities now have the size of medium-sized cities elsewhere, like Canberra or Wellington, for example, they don't have the mid-tier transit. They just rely on commuter rail and social safety net bus services. They actually really need this extra tier in order to create a public transport network that is more usable for more of their fast-growing number of citizens. In Perth, we do not have mid-tier transit at the moment, like I mentioned before. We have commuter rail and we have the bus network. So here we have a very different opportunity to actually bring a new kind of context of urban development and transit into our city, which is also fast growing, but it is mostly growing in an outward direction. In Perth, we can actually take the opportunity or use mid-tier transit as a catalyst to enable more growth in the existing urban area, in inner suburbs, in middle suburbs, and thus strengthen the heart of the city, so to speak. And then we were looking at the Sunshine Coast, an emerging city, which is moving towards 500,000 people, so it's much smaller than Perth or Melbourne, but it's still becoming something that we could definitely call a city, and a city that is not small anymore. It is now getting a fast rail connection to Brisbane, but same thing, that is a good link that links the Sunshine Coast and Brisbane, but it is not enough for internal transport within the Sunshine Coast. For that, it currently relies on buses like Perth, and what our project has been trying to show in this case is that there is also scope in the Sunshine Coast, much of which is based along a corridor on the coast where everyone wants to live and do their activities, that there is also scope for mid-tier transport here to strengthen the network and make the Sunshine City a more public transport oriented place, which is a bit hard to imagine from a place that is currently extremely car dependent, but we believe that it is possible. Again, I can speak for Melbourne and Sydney here, perhaps even more so about Sydney, where the tram system has been expanded quite drastically about 4 years ago and has been extremely successful in creating new urban spaces in the CBD in George Street, which has been completely redesigned and pedestrianised and is now a fantastic space for all sorts of activities, obviously for tram-based transit, but also for using the public space in a number of ways. And it also extends into inner suburbs, which have strengthened, which have become much easier to access, and it's become a lot easier for people to base their lives around public transport, because they can rely on this mid-tier transport mode to actually be there. And I can envision a similar thing in Perth, that we are actually opening up more areas that people now consider entirely car dependent and can't imagine to live a life without a car, to this kind of combination where cars aren't completely locked out, but where mid-tier transit and good walkability can actually create viable alternatives, so we actually have a more diverse transport system, so to speak, which is based on public transport, which is based on walking, and which is also based on car trips. Once we actually get a better integration of these happening, we can move Perth, and particularly areas in inner and middle suburban Perth, out of the current pattern of car dependence that they have as soon as you get away from the train station catchments. Sometimes it's just a lack of imagination. There are just some planners will say this is how we've always done things, and some of the people will say this is how we've always lived. How can you possibly live differently? Yes, I know I've been to Europe once and things were different, but it would never work in Australia, would it? Well, I think it can work in Australia, and we see it working in Sydney and Melbourne, and we are starting to see it working in the smaller cities as well. And I think some of the issues that have slowed it down in the past is that there has not been much integration between transport and land use planning. Transport planners, and I think I'm actually looking at Perth here, have been very good at creating dedicated transport facilities. I mean, look at our train system. As a train system, it's the envy of the world, and also the transfer facilities to buses, they're top-notch, they're world-class. But once it comes to actually integration with land use, that has not really been a priority. We have not got a lot of good station precincts where we could say, yes, we've actually created our transport infrastructures and we've built the appropriate land use around it. There are a few exceptions. Subiaco comes to mind, for example, but along the newer train lines, there's relatively few of them. We need to actually get better at that. And this is a barrier we need to overcome. We need to actually get land use planners and transport planners around a table and actually do these things together rather than separately. And that also includes, of course, the property market. I believe that affordable housing policies form an integral part of these kinds of intensification projects to avoid that they become entirely gentrified enclaves for the rich. And to create the kind of diversity that you actually need to run a proper city. I mean, it's not acceptable that we've got a situation which we actually also have in some parts of Melbourne and Sydney, where you have a lot of cafes on the street, but the people who work in the cafes can't afford to live anywhere nearby. They have to commute from 30 kilometers away because so we need to avoid these kinds of situations, and that's why affordable housing policy and the integration of affordable housing into these growing mixed-use districts is absolutely critical.